June 18, 1967, Monterey Pop Festival, California. Jimi Hendrix stood backstage holding a bottle of lighter fluid and staring at his guitar. In 30 minutes, he would walk onto that stage in front of 50,000 people, most of whom had never heard of him. The Who had just finished their set by smashing their instruments to pieces, and Jimi had made a decision that would either make his career or end it. He was going to set his guitar on fire. Not as a trick, not as a gimmick, but as a sacrifice. What happened in the 30 seconds after he lit that match didn't just shock 50,000 people. It created the most iconic moment in rock history and launched a career that would change music forever. To understand why Jimi Hendrix burned his guitar at Monterey, you need to understand where he was in June 1967. Jimi was famous in England. He'd spent the past 9 months tearing up London, impressing everyone from Eric Clapton to Paul McCartney to Pete Townsend. The British music press was calling him a genius, a revolutionary, the future of rock guitar. But in America, his home country, Jimi Hendrix was nobody. He'd left the United States a year earlier as a struggling session musician, playing backup for other artists, making barely enough money to survive. Now he was coming back as the Jimi Hendrix Experience, with a hit record in England and a reputation that preceded him. But that reputation was fragile. It was based on stories, on rumors, on second-hand accounts of what he could do on stage. The Monterey Pop Festival was his chance to prove it, to show America, to show the world that everything they'd heard was true, and maybe more than true. The festival was unlike anything that had happened in American music before. It was 3 days of performances featuring everyone who mattered in rock and roll. The Mamas and the Papas, the Byrds, Simon and Garfunkel, Janis Joplin, Otis Redding, and, on the final night, The Who, a British band known for their violent, destructive stage show, followed by Jimi Hendrix, an American guitarist most of the audience had never heard of. That running order was a problem. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones was supposed to introduce Jimi. He'd met him in London and become one of his biggest fans. On the afternoon of June 18th, Brian found Jimi backstage, looking nervous in a way Brian had never seen before. "You all right, man?" Brian asked. Jimi shook his head. "The Who are going to destroy their instruments. They do it at every show. Smash everything. That's their thing." Brian nodded. He'd seen The Who perform. It was spectacular and violent. Pete Townsend smashing his guitar, Keith Moon kicking over his drum kit. Total chaos. "So what are you going to do?" Brian asked.
Jimi looked at his guitar. It was a white Fender Stratocaster that he'd been playing for months. He'd written songs on it, recorded with it, performed with it dozens of times. It was like an extension of his body. "I'm going to burn it," Jimi said quietly. Brian stared at him. "Burn your guitar?" "Yeah." Jimi's voice was steady now, like he'd made peace with the decision. "They're going to smash theirs. I'm going to sacrifice mine. There's a difference." Brian understood immediately. Smashing was violence, destruction, chaos. Burning was ritual, sacrifice, transformation. It was the difference between breaking something and offering it to something larger than yourself. "You sure about this?" Brian asked. "That's a good guitar." "I know," Jimi said. "That's why it matters." At 11:30 p.m. on June 18, 1967, The Who took the stage at Monterey. They played a ferocious set, My Generation, Substitute, Happy Jack, building to the violent climax everyone expected. Pete Townsend smashed his guitar into his amplifier over and over until it splintered into pieces. Keith Moon kicked over his entire drum kit. Smoke bombs went off. The stage looked like a war zone. The crowd went absolutely wild, 50,000 people screaming, convinced they'd just witnessed the most explosive rock performance of their lives. Then The Who walked off stage, and the stage crew scrambled to clean up the debris. Backstage, Jimi Hendrix watched all of this on a monitor. His bandmates, Mitch Mitchell and Noel Redding, stood next to him, looking concerned. "How are we supposed to follow that?" Noel asked. Jimmy didn't answer. He was thinking about fire, about ritual, about the difference between destruction and transformation. Chaz Chandler, Jimmy's manager, walked over holding a can of lighter fluid he'd borrowed from someone's camping gear. He handed it to Jimmy without saying anything. They'd discussed this earlier, but seeing the can made it real. "You don't have to do this," Chaz said. "You could just play. You're good enough." "I know," Jimmy said, "but good enough isn't going to cut it tonight, not after what they just saw." At midnight, Brian Jones walked onto the Monterey stage to introduce Jimi Hendrix. The crowd was still buzzing from The Who's performance, talking amongst themselves, not particularly focused on what was about to happen. Brian's introduction was simple but powerful. "I'd like to introduce you to a very good friend of mine, a fellow countryman of yours, the most exciting performer I've ever heard, the Jimi Hendrix Experience." The crowd applauded politely. Most of them had no idea who Jimi Hendrix was. Then Jimmy walked onto the stage. He was wearing a bright psychedelic outfit, ruffled shirt, colorful vest, wild hair. He looked like nothing the American audience had ever seen before. He picked up his white Stratocaster, and the band launched into Killing Floor, a Howlin' Wolf blues song that Jimmy transformed into something entirely new. Within 30 seconds, the crowd understood. This wasn't just another guitarist. This was something different, something revolutionary. Jimmy played the guitar with his teeth. He played it behind his back. He played it between his legs. But these weren't just tricks. They were integrated into the music in a way that made them feel natural, inevitable, like this was simply how Jimi Hendrix communicated with his instrument. The crowd was transfixed. This was what they'd heard about. This was the legend made real.
Jimmy and the Experience played for 45 minutes. Foxy Lady, Hey Joe, Can You See Me, The Wind Cries Mary. Each song built on the last, creating a narrative arc that took the audience deeper into Jimmy's musical world. By the time they got to the final song, Wild Thing, the crowd was completely in Jimmy's hands. 50,000 people who'd been skeptical an hour ago were now believers. But Jimmy had one more thing to do, one more statement to make. During Wild Thing, Jimmy began creating sounds with his guitar that nobody had heard before. Feedback, distortion, noise that somehow remained musical. He made the guitar scream and wail and cry. The crowd watched, mesmerized as Jimmy pushed his instrument beyond anything they thought was possible. Then, near the end of the song, Jimmy did something that shocked everyone in the audience. He knelt down in front of his guitar, which was now resting against his amplifier, still feeding back, still creating sound. He pulled out a bottle of lighter fluid from his pocket, and in full view of 50,000 people, he began dousing his white Stratocaster with accelerant. The crowd went silent. Nobody knew what was happening. Nobody knew what this meant. Jimmy pulled out a match. Chaz Chandler, watching from the side of the stage, held his breath. They'd talked about this, but seeing it happen was different. This was a $150 guitar, a lot of money in 1967, and more than that, it was Jimmy's instrument. Destroying it was a real sacrifice, not a performance. Jimmy struck the match. The small flame flickered in the stage lights. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The music was still roaring from the amplifiers, feedback screaming into the California night. But everyone's attention was on that tiny flame in Jimmy's hand. Then Jimmy touched the flame to the guitar. The lighter fluid ignited instantly.
Flames erupted from the white Stratocaster, orange and blue fire engulfing the instrument. The guitar was still connected to the amplifier, still making sound, and now the sound of burning strings and crackling wood joined the feedback, creating a symphony of destruction and transformation. Jimi didn't step back. He stayed there, on his knees, controlling the fire, shaping it, using it like he used every other tool at his disposal. He picked up the burning guitar and raised it above his head like an offering. Flames licked up toward the sky. The crowd gasped. Then, in a movement that looked almost ritualistic, Jimi brought the burning guitar down and smashed it against the stage. Once, twice, 3 times, not in anger, but with purpose. Each impact sent sparks flying into the air. Each impact broke the guitar further apart, transforming it from an instrument into something else entirely. In those 30 seconds, Jimi Hendrix wasn't just performing, he was conducting a ritual, a sacrifice. He was offering this instrument, this extension of himself, to music itself, to the audience, to whatever gods of rock and roll might be watching. The crowd erupted, 50,000 people on their feet, screaming, not quite believing what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't destruction like The Who's violent smashing. This was something deeper, stranger, more profound. Photographer Jim Marshall captured the moment perfectly. His iconic image of Jimi kneeling before the burning guitar, flames rising, would become one of the most famous photographs in rock history. The image captured not just the spectacle, but the spirituality of the moment. When the fire finally died down, Jimi picked up the pieces of his destroyed guitar and threw them into the audience. People scrambled for the fragments, wanting to hold a piece of what they'd just witnessed. The neck of the guitar, charred and broken, ended up in a museum. Jimi walked off stage. He'd been on for less than an hour, but in that hour, and especially in those final 30 seconds, he'd accomplished what he'd come to Monterey to do. He'd shown America who Jimi Hendrix was. Backstage, everyone wanted to talk to him. Fellow musicians who'd watched from the side of the stage, festival organizers, photographers, everyone wanted to understand what they'd just seen. Pete Townsend of The Who came up to Jimi. He'd watched the whole performance from backstage, and his expression was a mixture of admiration and something like defeat. "How the hell do you follow that?" Pete said, shaking his head. "We smashed our instruments. You sacrificed yours. There's a difference."
Jimi nodded. That was exactly the point. Brian Jones found Jimi a few minutes later. "You did it, man. You really did it." "Did what?" Jimi asked, though he knew the answer. "Became a legend, right there, in one night." Brian was right. Before Monterey, Jimi Hendrix was a rumor, a story, a British phenomenon that Americans were curious about. After Monterey, he was a fact, an undeniable, overwhelming, impossible to ignore fact. The next morning, every music journalist at the festival was writing about Jimi Hendrix. The image of the burning guitar was on its way to becoming iconic. Record labels that had been hesitant about signing the Jimi Hendrix Experience were now desperate to work with him. Within 2 months, Are You Experienced, Jimi's debut album, would crack the American charts. Within a year, Jimi would be the highest-paid rock musician in the world, and it all traced back to that moment at Monterey, to 30 seconds of fire and sacrifice that changed everything. But here's what makes the story even more powerful. Jimi didn't burn his guitar because he wanted attention or because he wanted to compete with The Who. He burned it because it meant something to him, because sacrifice requires giving up something you value, not just breaking something for effect. Years later, Mitch Mitchell, Jimi's drummer, would explain it in an interview. Jimi loved that guitar. He'd played it for months, and that's why burning it mattered. It wasn't just a prop. It was his instrument, his voice, and he gave it up. That's what made it powerful.
The guitar burning at Monterey became Jimmy's signature move. He would do it again at other performances, though never quite with the same impact as that first time. Because that first time, it was new, it was unexpected, and it was necessary. That first time, Jimi Hendrix was an unknown American guitarist trying to prove himself in his own country. And in 30 seconds of fire and sacrifice and transformation, he didn't just prove himself, he transcended. He became something more than a musician. He became an icon. The image of Jimmy kneeling before his burning guitar has been reproduced millions of times on posters, album covers, t-shirts, documentaries. It's one of the most recognizable images in rock history. But what that image captures isn't just spectacle, it's sacrifice, it's transformation. It's the moment when someone gives up something they love to become something greater. June 18, 1967, Monterey Pop Festival. 50,000 witnesses, one white Stratocaster, one bottle of lighter fluid, one match. 30 seconds that changed rock and roll forever. Because Jimi Hendrix understood something that night that most performers never learn. The most powerful moments in music aren't about skill or showmanship or competition. They're about meaning, about ritual, about the willingness to destroy something beautiful to create something transcendent. The Who smashed their instruments in anger and chaos. Jimmy burned his guitar as an offering. And in that difference between destruction and sacrifice, between violence and ritual, between breaking and transforming, Jimi Hendrix became a legend. If this story of transformation, sacrifice, and the moment one guitarist changed rock history forever moved you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the most powerful acts aren't always the loudest, but the most meaningful. Have you ever sacrificed something important to become who you needed to be? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the moments when music became more than entertainment. It became transformation.